As always, we can rely on HOSPA to open our eyes to new opportunities, and this next session is a perfect example. Meeting and event strategy, what are we missing? Total revenue management is the key to success. To discuss this, please welcome to the stage, we have the right number of chairs by chance, Michael Hayward from Hayward Hospitality Solutions, and a welcome return to the stage for Heather Hart from RevExcel.
Thank you. Just finishing off the day, we thought we'd have a more casual conversation. You've had a lovely little teaser from Heather already, talking about all things M&E. As you would have seen on your notes in this conversation, we're coming back to everyone's favourite topic in revenue management, total revenue management. My background, yes, I am one of those vermin who's a consultant, sorry about that. But my background has been in revenue management and in operations. I've been very proud of some of the teams I've built and developed over the years, generating great results for hotels. And one of the teams that I worked with was collaborating with Heather, and we worked in that area, working in M&E as well as the more established rooms revenue management. But we've had a conversation that's been running for a long time now about why meeting and events revenue management isn't stronger in our industry. I mean, how long can you talk about this area before really coming to grips with what are the underlying issues that have left us in that situation? So Heather's had quite a bit to do with various systems, various approaches, various teams to address this, and has had success, which is why we felt she's the right person to talk about this. So coming back to our topic, we really, when we were talking about this, didn't want this to be a wagging finger lecturing afternoon piece saying, why don't you all get your act together, it's simple. The reason we haven't is it's not. So here's our pragmatic opportunity to talk a bit about why. So Heather, why?
Thanks. I think one of the key reasons, and I've noticed this across various different independent hotels and hotel groups, is we just don't have a structure and a culture that values meetings and events. I think within hotels, the real key focus is almost always bedrooms. I've spoken to senior vice presidents in major international companies who just quite blatantly will say, well, we only have meeting space to fill our bedrooms. And yet when you look at the type of hotels that there are, with a little bit like the example I gave earlier, you might have 200 bedrooms and 600 delegate spaces. Well, what are you going to do with all the rest of that space? Companies don't have someone sitting at a senior level, often driving meetings and events. There's so many different reasons why it just hasn't evolved. We don't have good systems and technology. We don't have good data. We don't have good skill sets. And you know, we just stand on any or all of those points, really. But it's as our overall culture in the hospitality industry, we really don't focus. We don't see the value, which is sort of what I was trying to get at earlier, of that space. And you know, so often when I do that type of exercise, saying, okay, how many delegate spaces do you have? What is that worth? It's like this massive light bulb going on because we just haven't sort of thought about it before.
So linking back to that conversation earlier on from the Cloudbusters, it sounds like we're covering quite similar ground here. We're talking about, is there a technology issue? Is there a people issue? And from our experience, and I think from what I've been seeing and hearing around the room, many of us would say there is a people, and also from many of your speakers today, we seem to keep coming back to talking about what's the leadership drive behind this. Just about everyone, I would imagine, could say for the hotels they've got, how many meeting rooms you've got. Typically the revenue managers, even at that point, start to scratch their heads. Have we used 3 meeting rooms today, or 1 or 4? 1 very large room, 3 smaller rooms, it's the same space. For me, it was transformational when we started working together, and you allowed us to make it simple and real and say, let's just talk about delegates. M&E, we generate the business from delegates. So we've recognised there's an issue in the people side, in the leadership side. What do you think are some of the really underlying issues with the revenue managers themselves? Surely that's the easiest person to convince. You're a revenue manager, right? How can this be not working?
No, absolutely. I think one of the key things, I've known many, I've been a revenue manager myself, but many revenue managers I've spoken to since really getting focused on meetings and events. And you say, why don't you look after M&E? Because, and oh no, I don't touch M&E. It's too messy. There's no good data, number one, for revenue managers to get their heads around. They sort of, M&E is seen as very operational, it's seen as very food and beverage, it's seen as function sheets and napkin colours, if you look at the weddings and all those sorts of things, AV equipment. We don't look at it as a strategic part of the business. And I think the key thing is that organisations, hotel companies, aren't targeting their revenue managers. They're not bonus, they're not incentivised on anything other than RevPAR, RGI, the traditional rooms focus. So we're not encouraging revenue managers to get involved. And so they're quite happy not to. And the danger of that is all of our decisions, often about our meeting space, are focused on what's good for the bedrooms. And because that's what they know. So you may turn away, for example, a residential conference for 20 people for 3 nights, where you've got day delegate packages, dinner packages and so forth, because the revenue manager is trying to get £20 more on the average room rate. And I've seen that happen in many instances, because their sole focus is not total revenue management. However much and however many years we've been talking about total revenue management, they are still focused and targeted on those key bedroom metrics. And often the meetings manager doesn't have a voice or a position or an authority, unless they go to the general manager and have a fight about it, to override that type of decision.
Do you think even with the meetings and events managers, there's some issues there around whether they have the right knowledge? I mean, I do a fair amount of corporate training these days. It appears to me in many of our mid-scale and many of our provincial hotels, we've got people working in meeting and events who get drawn quite heavily and consistently into working in the operations, making sure everything's set up right, dealing with that screaming presenter who can't find the VGA adapter or some issue like that. And as we've talked about for some time, looking at the measures of BDRC, which tends to be the people who do it best, from what I've seen, are well rated. What do you have to do to be good at this? You have to look at your conversions, your response times. Is there an element where we're getting something wrong with the way our M&E teams are working or trained or understand? How are we getting that part of it wrong?
No, that's a really good point. It does vary obviously from hotel to hotel, how big the department is. You do get some teams that are large enough where you can have a team who is really focused on converting, inquiry handling, converting. And then you have an event management team who look at the detail of the function sheets, and then they pass that off to the operations team. Now that happens well in a big hotel, but in smaller hotels, often you've just got a one-man band. You've got one person who's answering the phone, taking the inquiries, putting in the system, trying to make follow-up calls, doing the function sheets, having the row with the chef, going to the weekly meeting, maybe doing a duty management shift, and doing the meet and greet and making sure that things are set up. And you can't possibly expect that person to drive and grow the business commercially, because really all they're doing is getting through the day and trying to deliver a good customer service. You also have the situation where you're asking them to do an awful lot of different tasks that require an awful lot of different skills. So even in taking different inquiries, that bit of converting needs different skill set to producing a really good detailed function sheet and guiding a customer through running a really good event. The people issue is enormous, and one of the things comes back to, as you say, in terms of leadership, is the organisational structure in a hotel. Who owns meetings and events? Who drives that? Often it may report into sales, it might report into food and beverage, it might report to the general manager, but that's quite unlikely. It might report to the revenue manager, who doesn't really have that necessarily have those skills. I'm being very generic here. There are obviously exceptions to that rule, but they don't really have a place, and they have, they're sometimes just seen as an operational team. As if you go back 20 years, 25 maybe, the reservations team was seen as an admin wing of the front desk. It wasn't seen as a sales team, it wasn't seen as a commercial team. And that's where we are with meetings and events now. It's that team is seen as delivering, but not necessarily as commercial drivers.
So would you say, obviously the larger businesses with big meetings and events, revenues and volumes, they're typically going to have the kind of structure where they'll have good systems, they'll have a team covering sales and a team covering operations. For the vast majority of other hotels out there that have got great opportunity, what are the key couple of things they could do to try and address that? We've talked about revenue managers and maybe looking at how they're KPI'd. What would you do through that large proportion of our hotel portfolio in the UK?
I would definitely put a huge amount of focus on inquiry handling and conversion. I think, of course, operations and customer service delivery are incredibly important. But if you're not converting the business, if you're not tracking those inquiries, then you're just not going to be making the money. And very often hotels focus so much on just making budget. Are we making budget each week, each month? As opposed to really looking at what's the opportunity, how many opportunities are we missing? And in that inquiry handling, if you're not tracking, so many hotels I go to, if they turn a piece of business away, it doesn't go in the system. The piece of paper goes in the bin. And as we know as revenue managers, that's the most important bit of information is if I've taken a booking and I've filled that space, and then I get 4 more inquiries after that for the same date and the same space, if I'm not recording that somewhere, I'm going to keep taking the first piece of business that comes along, I'm going to keep making the same decision and not really being able to look strategically at my demand and make different decisions.
So on that strategic side, it sounds like that links back to all 3 of the points that we've covered now, from the leadership to the revenue to even the meetings and events guys. For those of us in rooms revenue management, many of us are lucky to have well-developed and well-established revenue management systems. One of the things we teach people when they put systems in is not just to understand the demand through to the full occupancy, but to understand the unconstrained demand. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like what you're talking about here is that many of our businesses aren't aware of it, aren't having that conversation. So what are the first steps that can be taken to address that? Sounds like conversion is probably a beginning point, but how do you actually make that happen?
Yeah. It's really interesting because when you start looking at hotels, meetings and events conversion rates, you will get some that are 15% because they're tracking everything.
Brilliant.
And you'll get some, interestingly, if you ask a hotel what their conversion rate is, they're usually very happy to tell you what their inquiry conversion is, but not necessarily their revenue conversion. And often that can be 2 very different things. A hotel can have a 40% inquiry conversion and a 15% revenue conversion. Now, in a city like London, that's not bad going. But if you go out to the provinces, that's actually that's not so good. You come to some hotels where they have a 78, 85% conversion rate, and you immediately know that all the bookings aren't getting tracked. They're definitely not all going in the system.
So you're not happy with the 70% conversion then?
You kind of have to question, is that, how real that is. Yeah. Often also bookings will go in the system without revenue attached. And so when you're looking at conversion rate, if you've got lost bookings with no revenue, because they don't put the revenue on until they're doing the function sheet, you've not got good data. So in order to sort of be able to make those better decisions and really understand what's going on with the business, you have to first have the systems to track that data. And you have to then, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you're not actually recording those inquiries, recording them accurately. And I truly understand, I've worked myself in many busy meetings and events offices, and the last thing you want to be doing when the phone's ringing and you've got to get a contract out and the chef's screaming for the function sheet is to spend those 2 or 3 minutes putting a booking into the system isn't going to happen. But the value of that data is extraordinary. And that's what will help guide better strategies, better revenue, better conversion. You touched on BDRC. I think That's one of the tools that we have in the industry. And there's a lot of mixed feeling about BDRC. A lot of hotels will say, oh, we know what a BDRC call is, and it either makes me too nervous so I got a bad score, or I get 100% because I know all the questions to ask. And the key thing is not really about the BDRC score, it's about why are we doing that? Why are we asking those questions? Because it comes back to that quality of inquiry handling, of understanding what's the reason for the booking, what's the client trying to achieve, really getting under the skin of that booking, and understanding the value of that booking as to, do I want it anyway, just because my space is sitting empty, is that the right booking for me? And having a better chance of converting it because I know so much about, I've made a connection with the booker, and I know so much more about it. Now, the other challenge we have in doing that is obviously so many of our inquiries now come through agencies. And so you often don't have the opportunity to get to that information, but it's why it's so much more important to do it when you have the opportunity.
But that really is coming back to one of the core principles of revenue management for rooms or anywhere really, isn't it? We're trying to make sure we're securing and converting the most valuable business. Every RMS I've ever looked at, the starting principle is where we have an opportunity to be, to any degree, selective with business, or even working with marketing teams to generate more of the right kind of business, you have to be knowing the value of one piece of business against another.
Yeah,
so that's...
But you have to be able to estimate demand, and you can only estimate demand if you have good data. So, for example, if I have a room that holds 20 people, most hotels will have a room that holds 20 people. I could put 10 people in that room, or I could put 15 people or 18 people in that room. Now, if I take the first inquiry that comes along for the 10 people, if I don't know that there's a good likelihood that in a week's time or a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to get a few more inquiries, and some of those might be for 15 or 18, it's about estimating and projecting and forecasting that demand, and you then make smarter decisions. But if you don't have good data on which to base those kind of decisions, you're leaving 50% plus on the table of revenue. And you're not always going to get it right, but it gives you that better chance of being able to be selective. But so many hotels just don't capture or use that data.
One of my favourite little exercises to do when I'm working with my students at Gleon or with anyone else that I'm doing revenue management training on is to ask that question, do you think we could change the average rate and the revenue of a hotel without changing the number of rooms sold or any of the prices? And it's interesting to see how people answer that. And you're leading towards a question about, well, what would happen if we sold a bit less of the cheap stuff and a bit more of the higher value stuff? But one of the things that struck me, particularly in the area of meetings and events, you can't just take the standard IHG or Accor or whoever else market segmentation that's designed for rooms and say, right, let's use this in the area of M&E. So how do you deal with that? Do you use segmentation to generalize about the value of one piece of business, broadly speaking, compared to another?
It is a different, you're right, it's a different kind of segmentation. So it's more about business type, if you like. So within a meetings team, you'll be taking weddings, you'll be taking banquets, you'll be taking meetings, you'll be taking big conferences,
Christmas parties,
exhibitions, Christmas parties, and so on. And each of those do have different values. It's very interesting when one of the things that I do a lot in training is say just take an average revenue per person, and often that is the daily delegate rate, because even if you look at a dinner spend, very often your dinner spend plus a bit of wine is often fairly equivalent, Christmas party aside, to your day delegate price. So it's looking at perhaps you can get across all of your segments a fairly good average spend, but a typical decision of that would be, or example of that would be at a weekend. Do I hold out for a residential like association conference, or do I take a wedding? What's the value of my bar spend? What's the value of, how do I equate? How do I look at the, and of course you're factoring in bedroom spend as well into that, but how do I evaluate between what's going to A, bring me the most revenue, B, bring me the most profit, or be most efficient for the organisation, what's the most likely to convert? So you're constantly juggling and balancing different types of business, and they all have their own pluses and minuses.
And at this point we get to play celebrity chef here, because rather than asking the room for questions and waiting and hoping, we have one we prepared earlier. So in the area of segmentation, we have in the audience today Chiara Crossan, founder and CEO of Wedding Dates. I'm hoping you've got a microphone. Yep, hand waving over there. If we could get a microphone across to you. We're very much hoteliers, we're revenue managers, and obviously Heather with the expertise in meeting events. But for you, looking at what we're doing in hotels from the outside, what do you think we need to be knowing about in your area with weddings?
Hello?
You're on.
I just loved this whole session. I just tweeted, I'm like a nodding dog in the audience. Like everything you're saying, Heather, is so spot on what I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis. So with our clients, we work with hotels to help fill their available inventory with weddings. And our system allows them to generate leads and track them and conversion. But what I'm really seeing is that a lot of places, and it comes down to, you know, what you said, I think, the people element, they're just focused on number of weddings. You know, weddings are down, number of weddings are down, and they're not thinking about the revenue per wedding, let alone the profit per wedding. Mm-hmm. So I'm recently, we're looking at evolving the software and bringing more of a revenue element into it. And I recently did an exercise with some of my clients where I asked them what was their net profit per wedding. And the answers varied so widely, first of all, but in some cases they weren't able to answer. And, you know, even at GM level, you know, reputable 4-star, I think one in particular, 4-star hotel, down Southampton, and the GM said, Ciara, you know, it's a really interesting question, and I hope you don't mind, but it did actually take me too long to calculate that, so good luck with your project, kind of thing. So it's just really interesting to me, and I suppose my question is, how can we demystify that? You know, we're in a room full of revenue managers here, and most, you know, you guys in the room are the experts, but especially when we're looking at the meetings and events team, they're the salespeople, and particularly with weddings, people negotiate a lot more maybe than they do on the corporate side. You know, what else can you throw in for me? You know, it's way more of that emotive personal sell, and it's their own money. So how can we demystify that and educate the meetings and events team and the sales team on the profit and the revenue management side of it?
No, it's a great question.
Must be yours then.
I think there's a couple of things there, and one is where possible, and again it depends on the size of the hotel and the size of the team, and you come across some hotels that do more than 52 weddings a year, so they're doing more than one every Saturday. They're doing Fridays, they're maybe doing 2 on a Saturday. They are wedding venues, and they of course then have wedding specialists. They may not go down to the profit level at that, but they are the type of people who will love to sit for 45 minutes and talk to the bride's mother about the colour of the napkins. You know, that's a special kind of person. I'm not that kind of person. I like the big corporate events. But it's horses for courses. So number one, if at all possible, it's having a specialist that really understands that piece of business, understands what it takes. Because it is very, you know, weddings can be for a hotel very labour intensive in terms of all of the information leading up to the changes, the detail, and it's somebody's really special day and you want to get it right. So they can be, they need a special kind of attention. In terms of profitability, I completely agree with you. It does shock me enormously that many hotels don't work out their profitability, but they don't work out their revenue potential. So, adding into that, they know their food and beverage percentages. It does. I would just throw a small anecdote in here because it does still in hotels, I feel. We are far too focused on GP percentages and sometimes turn away business that will still make us a profit but won't necessarily make us the right percentage. And particularly when we go through downtimes, that's an anathema to me because just, it's good, we want to get that revenue and that profit in. But I think an awful lot more, you're right, an awful lot more, having some ready reckoners, having some simple things that say, 40 people at this price is going to give us, for this menu is going to give us X amount of profit, would help the teams to be able to make that analysis quickly. The number of times I've seen hotel teams go off and have to sit down and do the calculation if they're trying to weigh up two pieces of business. I guess the other thing I'd say in terms of profitability is often, and I think it's changing a lot now, but often the proactive sales team don't take accountability for profit. And I'm not sure that's wrong because they have no control over what the costs are of a particular booking. I think because now channel management has become, the cost of acquisition has become, with commissions and channel fees and all those sorts of things, has become much more the domain of a revenue manager. We are thinking much more about the cost of acquiring business as opposed to the cost of servicing business. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely something that's changing, and I think definitely an awareness that could definitely be improved.
Another one of the areas which, we really came to grips with this in rooms revenue management 15 to 20 years ago, is looking at dynamic pricing. And I think the weddings market is an interesting example of this, where people will say, yes, we have pricing in our peak summer weekends that reflects the demand, and then on the shoulders of that different pricing. But to me, that's more seasonal pricing. Mm-hmm. That's not dynamic pricing. You've talked about understanding the demand. You've talked about some of the, let's call them dynamic tensions, with whether it's the revenue manager or the chef. Do you think we need to have an approach to being more dynamic and confident in pricing based on demand? Mm-hmm. And if so, how do you think we can actually go about doing that?
Yeah. That's such a key point, because one of the things I think that drove that in rooms management, I go way back to the days before the internet, before, when you had your FIT market and you had mm-hmm. certain, you priced for a market, for a type
season
of business.
And a market. Yeah, absolutely.
But what changed was the internet. What changed was distribution, and the need to rapidly change pricing. So that worked in rooms. Because we haven't had until very recently the ability to look at online distribution for meetings and events, there hasn't been the drivers to say we really need to have good yield management, revenue management, dynamic pricing that we can control for onward distribution. So it's what drives that decision, I think, a little bit. One of the things that I've talked a lot about in training within hotels is saying, how do you set your pricing? What does it do? And invariably you get back, January, February is quite quiet, and May and June's fairly busy, and November and October are good conference months. And we have these month-long pricing, and it comes back a little bit to the data. It comes back to the sales and catering systems and being able to get good data out of those systems, so good data in, good data out, to understand our demand patterns. Because very often you might find that the third Wednesday in January is a lot busier in terms of demand than the first Tuesday in June. But because we have these sort of set criteria over long periods of time, we don't dynamically price based on expected demand, as we automatically do in rooms. So number one thing is we need better data, and we then need to look at that data and be more confident about pricing dynamically. And you still get a lot of those answers back from, you talk to conference teams, clients won't understand why they have to pay £72 day delegate rate on this day, but they can get it for £65 on another day. And actually, yes, they do. We do it in planes, we do it in hotel bedrooms, we do it in, we seasonally manage or daily manage even rate changes. And I think the market is pretty much used to that now. And so having a much more, I've come across conference hotels who don't flex their day delegate rate at all. And that's just simply because they don't have the information as to when and how they should do it. And so it's just a standard price. And I think moving towards that demand-led pricing, dynamic pricing, is definitely the way to go. And if we had better tools and better data, we could do that, which would also help the online distribution.
So thinking more about the pricing, and you're talking about day delegates, do you think the simplification of packaging it all up and just treating things as day delegate, is that the way to go? There are some clients that I work with that are very much, no, come on, we want to have it all separated out. It makes it easier for us to do upselling or whatever it may be. Is day delegate the way to go?
I think it's I've always been a fan of a day delegate price, and I think clients to some extent are. There are always exceptions to that, because you know the number of people and you know what you're getting. And for simple events, that works fine. Obviously, then you get other things added in and so forth. I think what happened after the sort of major recession, 2008, 9, 10, etc., when the conference market really, really took a big hit, is hotels got a bit scared, customers got a bit more aggressive, and a lot of hotels simply started quoting room hire because it seemed cheaper. And so still that happens a lot today. You know, you build up a package or you build up the charges, but what you want is a cheaper sort of lead-in price. And I think we have to re-educate the market back to saying it's actually better value for you. Obviously, it's better for the hotel because you're getting commitment for that whole package. They're not going to go down to the pub for lunch or, you know, whatever that may be. But having encouraging people to buy the way you want them to buy, and giving them a good reason to do that, I think we need to get back a little bit, because our revenues have been compressed because of a lot of those allowing clients not to commit to buying that package. I mean, the whole idea of a package is it's easier for the customer, but you know, again, that doesn't work for everyone. But it depends what, you know, obviously if you're talking banqueting and you're adding dinners and you're in drinks receptions and all that sort of thing, then you're going to get bespoke pricing. But yes, I'm a great supporter of packages. What, just interestingly on the room side again, if you look at what always has amused me or frustrated me, is that if you look at a day delegate package, you always have a good chunk of revenue that goes to room hire. So you can really look at genuine profitability coming out of meetings and events, because you have a cost of setting up the room and a cost of servicing the room, and you've got a room hire there that's probably akin to a profit percentage to bedrooms. But as soon as you move to a 24-hour delegate rate, away goes that element of room hire, because it's gone off to the bedrooms so that it shows a better average room rate. I've yet to find a hotel that doesn't do that, which is quite shocking really, because again, it just comes back to this whole element of rooms take priority, and the room's performance is far more valuable to the business, even though it's the same money, it's just being moved into a different pot to essentially make it look better, make your average rate look better.
Another area that we've touched on in our conversations before, when you look at the difference between the big businesses that do a lot of meetings and events and the ones that seem to not have it as a priority, linking back to the data, the standards in the industry, the bigger businesses tend to be pretty disciplined about having the weekly meeting. Mm-hmm. So you'll have a revenue meeting, but you'll also have an M&E meeting, which the revenue manager will be at. The sorts of things you'll typically be hearing about, very similar to what we hear about in rooms revenue management. You'll be looking at pick-up, pace, on the books. You'll be very clear about the terminology on things like prospect, tentative, definite. That seems to me to be entirely absent in the ones that are not treating it as seriously and understanding the potential. So again, trying to be really pragmatic here. Is there a first step you can take or a starting point that can get you on the way to really getting the culture and the team to understand those principles and begin to realize some of this opportunity and potential? How do you make that first step?
I think one of the key things is having a few, not many, but having a few key KPIs. So things like measuring a delegate density, not just talking about, are we going to make budget for the month? Very often those M&E meetings end up talking about the business that's coming in and the function sheets, or maybe it's the big inquiries that are on, but it's either a sales-led meeting or an operational-led meeting, not a strategically led meeting. Mm-hmm. And so to get that strategy, you have to kind of start at a point where you say, well, what are those measures that are going to help us drive the business forward and help us look at and examine what we're doing? So things like delegate density, saying, yeah, I have space for 600 delegates across my space, and yesterday we only sold 120. How do we change that? Where are our peaks and troughs coming? Being able to look at that data, being able to forecast demand, and then looking at your performance accordingly. Because at the moment with meeting space, if you're looking at how well or badly you're doing, people will look at function room occupancy. So I've got 8 rooms, I sold 8 rooms, hey, I got 100%. But maybe you only sold 25% of your actual delegate space. And then of course you have to look at, because some of them may be syndicates, and what money did you get for the syndicates and so on. But looking at that delegate piece allows you to value that space. So a syndicate, for example, that you might give away for £150 might hold 10 people that you could have got £50 a head for. So that space is worth £500, but you're happy to give it away as a syndicate for 150. So it's starting to take those simple steps, even without sophisticated systems and technology, looking at simple steps of understanding the value that you have and how well you're getting close to that, and identifying the times that you have the opportunity to do better, and tracking those turnaways so that you can see what opportunities you've missed.
Unconstrained demand.
Absolutely. Not hitting anyone around the head because they made the wrong decision, but saying next time, we can do that better. Then just very quickly, the number of times that in a function room, in budget meetings and so on, people said, "Oh, we had that big piece of business this time last year. It's not going to come back again, so we've got to drop the budget." Had they known, had they recorded that they had 4 or 5 other pieces of business that inquired afterwards that they couldn't convert, that they had to turn away, then that might not, have the same result.
My other favourite conversation, I must say, around budget time is when you hear the classic cry of, "Oh, well, yes, we only had a good month last year because we had that one-off piece of business. That definitely won't happen next year." From a demand point of view, how do you handle that? I mean, the room's demand tends to stick pretty reliably to the sorts of days and the demand drivers around them. Meetings and events doesn't happen that way.
Although interestingly, you can, if you can track back to previous years of demand, you'll usually find that within a month, there's always a week, and you can track it year after year. One of the things that we did with one of the reasons to develop Smart Space was to be able to visualize that data. And when you can put 3, 4, 5 years of number of inquiries of demand against each other, and you start to see those patterns just illuminate, there's usually a week, and you don't know whether it's going to be the Tuesday or the Wednesday or even the Thursday, but that's the week that you really need to protect and watch out for.
So we need to be able to start having the conversations that say, well, we know in the back end of November we should expect to be able to convert 1 or 2 of these kinds of business without necessarily being able to nail down the day.
Right.
That's the time of year when that stuff's out there. We need to secure at least our share, if not ideally more than our share of that business.
And you then price accordingly, and then you also hold out for this right size of business, because actually, again, it's those delegate numbers. Rather than just taking that booking for 150 in my room that holds 300, I'm going to hold out for 200, 250, because I know that demand is going to be there. It's a juggling act, but it's possible to do that. We do it in rooms, and all the information's there sitting in systems.
Part of the reason I asked about things like lead time is if you read the BDRC reports and various things that come out, one of the things they often talk to us about is bigger pieces of business, the lead time's getting shorter and that kind of thing. How much do you look at those sorts of things with the hotels you're working at to adjust your expectations on that longer year-to-year basis?
The really important thing with lead time is not just looking at overall lead time, but looking at lead time by size of booking. Right. So one of the things that we really focused on breaking down, because hotels have different spaces, is how many bookings do I get for 1 to 10 people, for 10 to 20 people, for 30 to 50 people, and so on all the way up. And then looking at the lead times of those categories. So of course we know instinctively that the larger bookings are longer lead, but actually what you often find is, surprisingly, there's some in that mid-range, say 60 to 100, that are booking a week to 2 weeks out. And that's really useful information. And also the number of smaller bookings that book a long way out. And are we taking them and then turning away, as I say, taking the 10s and then turning away the 15s and 20s? Without, again, having that analysis of that information, you're always going to be missing opportunity.
So we're needing to have the time and understanding to think about and look at what's going on. We need to have the measurement and the focus on the things to look at. so that we can choose to take educated risks and deliver better results. I think what I like the most about being given the opportunity to enjoy having this conversation with Heather, for any red-blooded revenue manager out there, this has got to scream opportunity to you. The vast majority of your competitors are not doing this well. This is easy pickings. This is where you can say to yourself, here's somewhere where I can really make my next big difference into this business, rather than fighting over the same territory everyone's been fighting over.
Yep, absolutely.
So without dominating Heather's time, is there anyone else who would like to ask any questions of our expert on the stage? Yeah? One question over here. Good eyesight. Yep.
That's all right.
You touched on it a little bit in terms of sort of how we overcome it, but on the revenue management recruit set, a lot of the time I tend to find that candidates are a little bit averse to working in M&E because they see it as a little bit less dynamic and they're not going to be able to impact it as much as they want to. How do you overcome that perception to get the talent that you need to sort of kick forward?
Great question. To me, I used to be a rooms revenue manager. I came up through revenue management, 900-bedroom hotel complex. I was rooms. And then I won't say I saw the light because I still love rooms management. But for me, meetings and events is so much more dynamic. It's so much more interesting. There's so much more turnover. It's probably less precise, but a lot more interesting and exciting. Of being able to, as long as you can get your hands on that data. And so it's exposure, I guess, that is going to change that, but it's just opening up. It's for revenue managers, having them think more on the data and analytical side and not think about the function sheets. And they don't even have to get involved with that. It doesn't matter who's coming in. It doesn't matter what the booking is. What they will need to look at is how many people, what's the value, when's it coming, do we convert the right piece of business? All the analytics that we would normally look at, that they're used to seeing in rooms, we can get all of that, pace, lead time, all of those things. And so it's sort of getting them not to think too much about the operational side and focus on the data.
The simple thing that I would add to that is look at the revenue management and M&E resources you've got and try and draw them closer to each other. Get the RM to be more aware and involved in M&E, and get the M&E guys to be more involved and integrated and collaborating with RM, because adding resource is hard, recruiting something new and different is hard. The starting point is to get them understanding and working better together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you all very much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. Thanks,